Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Important Pictures, a walk through history. I'm Laura Mogul from Landmark on Main Street, and I am so happy to be able to introduce our friends and our host for this evening, and our instructor, our professor of all things port from the Kaunak Peninsula Historical Society. Please welcome Chris Bain.
Thank you once again for zooming in this evening. I'm Chris Bain, the president of the Kaunak Peninsula Historical Society, here in scenic Port Washington, just 4 days from the first day of spring. As in my earlier presentations, I'd like to thank Laura Mogul and the good folks at Landmark on Main Street for hosting these Zoom presentations. Before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to the members of Shriver's class of 1964 who have joined us tonight, including Amy Bass, Doug Pittman, Robert Mitchell, and others. And a second shout out to my own Schreiber class of 1973, who are also on board tonight. You know who you are. If you missed my earlier presentations on the Mill Pond Historic District, Along the Shore, or Origins of Main Street School, you can watch the recorded videos on our website at www.kaunek.org or on the YouTube channel that Landmark on Main Street hosts. I'd also like to thank those of you who have renewed your membership to the Society or joined for the first time. Your support of our town's historical society is truly appreciated and never taken for granted. Each of our websites, the historical societies as well as Landmark on Main Streets, has numerous ways where you can support these historic institutions. For instance, here is the Sands Willets House last spring, which many of you might recognize. Here is the Sands Willets House about 110 years ago. This is our beautiful porch last summer. And this is how it looked 2 weeks ago, since after 110 years it was in dire need of repair and stabilization. It also needed the addition of an ADA-compliant access ramp for those who use wheelchairs, walkers, or who are just pushing strollers. Because of a large matching grant from the Gardner Foundation, along with the help from a few other institutions and local families, we are finally able to rebuild the porch and make our house museum accessible to many more people. That is one way your membership dollars as well as your donations help us, so thank you. Tonight's presentation is a little different in as much as it doesn't focus on one area of town or a specific theme. We're highlighting about 16 different spots on our peninsula that are worthy of historic recognition. What they have in common is a rich local history and often a good story. This program is overseen by Ross Lumpkin, one of our trustees whose many articles you may have read in the local papers. The idea is based on a similar program that the Great Neck Historical Society has had for several years, though we've tweaked it in a few ways. Our historic recognition program has 3 different sizes and types of plaques, as shown here. The first 2 offer opportunities to say as much or as little as you can fit. The third just states when the structure was built. They are made of precision-tooled bronze. Please note that we don't sell these plaques, and we don't make a dime from them. Ross helps you figure out what to say, and then arranges for them to be made. You can mount them yourself, or we can suggest a very handy guy that can do it for you. For more information and costs, please contact ross@kaunek.org. Okay, it's time to jump right in. Understand that for many of these locations, I'm only able to give a brief overview due to time constraints. So please visit our website and pull down the menu labeled Recognition to read more in-depth stories about all of these sites, such as tonight's first subject. Carl Fisher is a name that you may or may not know, though there have been several books written about this fascinating entrepreneur. As a young man, he raced bicycles. Then he invented a headlight for those newfangled automobiles that were catching on, allowing them to drive after dark. He had big dreams, however. With the millions he made from the headlight business, he and a few wealthy partners founded the Indianapolis Motor Parkway, leading to the Indianapolis 500. In 1912, realizing that there were no paved roads across the country, no highways, much pavement at all between cities, really, Carl Fisher helped create the first one, known as the Lincoln Highway. Then, along with a few partners who shared Fisher's vision, they took a desolate barrier island at the southern tip of Florida and developed the resort city of Miami. By 1926, he was worth an estimated $100 million. In the late 20s, he tried to repeat this success by turning a tiny fishing village into a major resort at the tip of Long Island. That was Montauk, though the crash of 1929 stopped development in its tracks and eventually bankrupted Fisher. However, several years earlier, he visited friends in Port Washington, falling in love with our coastal town. He bought a chunk of waterfront property just south of what is now Dolphin Green Apartments and created a community of 55 homes called Bayview Colony. His own house was built in 1926 fronting Manhasset Bay, which would also serve as a satellite location of the newly formed Montauk Yacht Club. In the background of this advertisement, you can see his house. Carl Fisher also brought the Purdy Boat Company to Port Washington, gaining a nationwide reputation for building stunning racing boats and luxury yachts, including my personal favorite, Aphrodite. In 2005, the present owners started a multi-year restoration of this wonderful house, restoring it completely while bringing scores of modern touches and green technology that brought it fully into the 21st century. It is truly a beautiful home, and Carl Fisher would be most pleased. The wording on our plaques is a collaborative effort between the homeowner or the business owner and the society. So we'll move on to Plandome Mills. Plandome Mills was one of 3 tidal grist mills on the Cowneck Peninsula. I discussed the first 2 mills right near the mill pond in earlier presentations. Built in 1693, Plandome Mills operated continuously for just over 200 years until 1900, when it broke down and was finally abandoned. In the early 1950s, the town of North Hempstead was considering widening that portion of Plandome Road past Leeds Pond. Luckily for local history's sake, a Joseph Packard purchased the mill and some adjoining property. He had the mill moved about 120 feet and converted it to a residence. The Packards retained the basic structure, incorporating the original grain hoppers and grinding stones, which are still on display on the second floor. In 1988, this waterfront property and former grist mill was purchased by the current owners, Ted and Judy Goldsmith. They also purchased the property next door, which wasn't in good condition and which blocked much of their view of Manhasset Bay. They took down that second house and created a marshland in harmony with the shoreline. They have even created artful sculptures from some of the found pieces of the mill. As Mr. Goldsmith stated, the plaque will add value to our property without imposing restrictions on a potential buyer. When the time comes, it will help attract the kind of preservation-minded buyer that we hope to find. Next is S.F. Falconer Florist. We also believe in recognizing businesses that have a multi-generational heritage in town or have contributed toward the betterment of the community over many decades. We all know Falconer's, the florist on South Maryland Avenue. Owned and managed by Fred Falconer, the fascinating here starts with his grandfather, Simon Frederick Falconer, the S and F in the company name. To quote an article on our website, Simon Frederick Falconer came to the U.S. in the early 20th century from Scotland, where he had been trained in gardening and in agriculture. He eventually became the head groundskeeper and greenhouse supervisor at one of the Guggenheim estates in Sands Point. This image shows the cold frames, greenhouses, and conservatories at the Gould estate. Now, the Gould estate was sold to Daniel Guggenheim in 1917, and these may not be the exact ones that Simon oversaw, but they very well might be. When Simon decided to leave service in 1920 and open up a shop of his own in town, Harry Guggenheim gave him one of the greenhouses, which was moved to the new location on South Maryland Avenue. Harry Guggenheim also gave him his floral business and recommended Falconer to his Sands Point friends. The greenhouse is still in use today as one of the 4 greenhouses on the property. That is Simon Frederick Falconer standing behind the corner. And this is grandson Fred Falconer, proudly displaying his historic plaque. Then we move on to the Samuel Dodge House. This is the beautifully restored home at 1 Sandy Hollow Road. The early records of the property show that it was owned by Samuel Dodge, one of the original settlers of Port Washington. It has been lovingly cared for by a succession of owners. And yes, you can see by the signs that the current owners are moving on and the house is on the market, awaiting a special person who embraces this 18th century structure. Just for fun, these are 2 images of the interior today. Note the original wide plank floors. I've been in this house a few times, and in the last light of the afternoon, the rooms almost glow from the sunset over the mill pond. So for reference, here's the exterior once again. And here is a photograph from the same angle, in about 1900. The most well-known family to own this house, after the Dodge family, was the Bruner family, probably because of their daughter, Susie Bruner. She was such a well-known character in town. Before the railroad arrived in 1898, Susie used to ride her horse and buggy to and from Great Neck every day to deliver our town's outgoing mail and to pick up mail that was bound for port. She was one tough lady, and I would suggest you visit our website to read her story. The Bruner family lived in the house for several decades and operated a candy store in front. It was the perfect location, right at the bottom of the wooden steps which led down from the school on the hill. The perfect place for a candy store. The Samuel Dodge Barn, also known as the Aida and Daniel Whedon Residence and Studio. The same Samuel Dodge from the last location also had a barn up the road, also owned later by Susie Bruner, who, it turned out, ended up owning several properties on what is now Sandy Hollow Road. In the 1930s, it was converted to a residence by William Pedrick, who thankfully left much of the open spaces of the original barn intact. Daniel and Aida Whedon purchased the house in 1958 and lived there for decades, utilizing it as an art studio and gallery. It was said of Aida Whedon that her most enduring legacy remains the hundreds of Port children who were introduced to the world of art by her teaching. Dan was a sculptor, ceramicist, and cabinet maker. One of his whimsical pieces is on the left. Aida was a painter, ceramicist, sculptor, and in her later years an etcher. 2 of her paintings are included here as well. Together, they opened up the Whedon School of Art, where they taught hundreds of local children and adults for 50 years. A short walk to the other side of the mill pond brings us to the Cato Sands house. It's sometimes difficult to believe about our seemingly bucolic little village, but many of the wealthy landowners of Sands Point owned slaves. This story can get a bit confusing because there is no definitive records that have ever been found, and the name Cato was passed down from father to son to grandson. But in short, Cato Sands I was one of about 5 slaves owned by Simon Sands, a landowner in Sands Point. Sands freed Cato in 1782. The reasons are unclear, but some have theorized that Cato may have helped Sands in some meaningful way during the Revolution. 52 years later, Cato Jr. purchased more than 3 acres of land at the mill pond for $400. This image shows the current owners of the house in the center, holding the plaque, surrounded by local politicians, ministers, and a few of us from the society. CBS News even sent a video crew out to interview the participants. You can watch this video on our website. Newsday covered it with a great story as well. Back in 2006, Sands Point's Historic Landmarks Preservation Commission mounted this sign at a small African American cemetery, which is on the grounds of the Village Club at Sands Point. This property was formerly owned by Isaac Guggenheim and Samuel Sands much earlier. Cato is listed in the middle line, with information taken from his broken stone shown here. However, if you want to read a wonderfully researched article on the broader topic, our website has The World of Cato Sands, an article written by the former trustee Jacqueline Bain in 1980. This brings us to the Cadams family optometry practice. In 1905, the Hotel Victoria was built on the corner of Flower Hill Avenue, which you know is Main Street, and Haven Avenue. As the center of town was already shifting from the waterfront to the area near the train station, the hotel thrived. In 1929, it was torn down, and the Port Plaza building was built in its place, with retail stores at the street level and offices above. It's a beautiful building, isn't it? Starbucks commands this corner today. This view from the other direction shows the 1938 arrival of Dr. Herman Cadams, optometrist. This current image shows that the family business has not only survived these 83 years, but has thrived, with Herman's son, Dr. Sandy Cadams, proprietor, and Herman's granddaughter, Dr. Rachel Cadams, recently joining the practice. Nicer people you'll never meet. We'll move on to the Mount Olive African American Episcopal Church. This is the old Free Church, built in 1859 near the back of the mill pond at the corner of Pleasant Avenue and across the street from the Talmadge Dodge homestead. I covered this in my mill pond presentation. This news item from the Long Island Farmer and Advertiser reported on the new church, and while they got the town mixed up with Manhasset, they got the rest of the facts correct, especially this piece. Although the Methodists predominate, or are the most energetic there, yet this house will be open to the ministers of any denomination that may wish to preach the everlasting gospel. The Mount Olive AME Church, as Port Washington's first black church, had formed in 1897 and was using the Free Church along with several other denominations. The church was feeling the strains of demand, and Mount Olive decided to move uptown in 1903 to Mackey Avenue. Here's the cornerstone from May 17, 1903. Pastor Jacqueline Lynch is seen here holding the plaque along with other pastors and friends of the congregation. This is a good example of how much information you can fit on a plaque. We'll stay on the church theme for a few minutes. St. Peter of Alcantara Roman Catholic Church. During the 1800s, Catholics had to travel to Flushing to attend Sunday Mass, followed later by St. Mary's of Manhasset in 1857. By 1900, it was apparent to the bishop that the Catholics in Port Washington would be able to support a church of their own. Congressman William B. Cochran, famous orator and chief benefactor, offered to donate land on part of his property, which encompassed most of what we now know as Harbor Acres. Cochrane also donated $50,000 for the building of the church. Work quickly pushed forward, and the cornerstone was laid in November of 1902. The first Mass was celebrated on September 6, 1903. This image shows part of Cochrane's farm, with the newly finished church in the upper left corner. His land stretched all the way back to Hempstead Harbor. Here's the church today, and if you've never seen their famous gargoyles up close, now you have. St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. If I might, I'll quote Alan Dinn's first two sentences from his excellent article on our website. In 1890, there were only two churches on our peninsula, the Old Free Church down by the mill pond where the Baptists still held service, and the Methodist Church recently moved to the site now occupied by the public library. A third congregation would soon join them. This is their first chapel, built in 1896 on the corner of Jackson and Covert Street, before it was moved to Carlton Avenue in 1905. St. Stephen's was incorporated in 1905, and this stone building was started in 1908, soon to replace the original small wood chapel that had been purchased by the Women's Guild. The original stone building was only about half as long as it is now. Here is a view from the curve on the Flower Hill Avenue side, later renamed Main Street. Note the overhead electrical wires for our short-lived trolley, which ran from 1908 to 1920 between Port Washington and Mineola. And here is the view from the Carlton Avenue side, showing the original chapel on the right. And I just have to show a pair of happy gentlemen, Alan Dinn and trustee Ross Lumpkin, holding the plaque just prior to the installation on the right side of the door. The Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, found at the intersection of Avenue A and Valley Road. The first pastor, Reverend D.L. Austin, had established the church in his home in 1920, and then used his carpentry skills to build this beautiful little church in 1921. The 6 founding members became known for giving shelter to many African Americans migrating from the South to work in the great estates in nearby Sands Point. Here is the interior, and in this year of their centennial anniversary, the members of the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church share a strong spiritual tie that binds them together. The Port Washington Tennis Academy. Again, borrowing from some of Ross's text from the article on our website. When Hy Zausner founded the Port Washington Tennis Academy in 1966, it was nothing more than a few outdoor courts on a back road. It quickly became a hangout for local kids to play tennis, one he hoped would keep them away from smoking, drugs, or whatever else they might get into trouble with. A few years later, after Hy had a heart attack, his son Dick moved here to help out, and together they transformed it into a tennis academy for juniors. Still, the PWTA became best known for having trained young players such as John McEnroe, Vitas Gerulaitis, and Tracy Austin before they all went pro. Hy passed away in 1992, and Dick continued in his father's footsteps, serving the community for more than 50 years. The Vincent Smith School, which is the next-door neighbor of the Kowneck Peninsula Historical Society. The Vincent Smith School was opened under the name the Harbor School on Bayview Avenue in 1923. Sir Gilbert and Lady Elliot, along with Miss Adelaide Vincent Smith, co-founded the school with the intention of ensuring a private education for the children of the Elliott family and other affluent families in the area. The next year, they changed the name to honor the co-founder and first principal, Adelaide Vincent Smith, though, as the story goes, they dropped the Adelaide, supposedly with the thought that a serious school couldn't be named after a woman. Tell that to these young women in their science lab in the 1930s. Here are two more images from the 1930s. That's Adelaide Vincent Smith on the right and Principal Nolora Reeder on the left. Although it started as a school for affluent families of Port Washington, Vincent Smith is now a nonprofit organization which operates as a K-12 special education school. The school prides itself on its mission to meet the individual specialized needs of its students. Shore sculpture. In 1996, at the age of 70, Jerry Shore retired from a successful life in business. In the mid-50s, he had co-founded Park Electronics and served as its CEO until his retirement. Today, Park Electronics is a multinational company on the New York Stock Exchange with more than 500 employees. Jerry converted a warehouse on Valley Road into a studio to pursue his lifelong dream to be a professional sculptor. Several of his sculptures, including this one titled Red Sails, are featured at the Bay Walk alongside Manhasset Bay across the street from Diwan, the Indian restaurant. This one is called Snowbirds. They all have lengthier discussions on our website. HO/80 was a gift that Jerry gave to one of his best friends, Howard Olean, on his 80th birthday. It's shown here at the Village Club. Beautiful shot overlooking Hempstead Harbor. The Sands Barn. In the 1970s, when the Cowneck Peninsula Historical Society was some 10 years young, its past president, Harry Williams, had a dream: to find a suitable bar to complement the society's recently acquired home, an 18th century farmhouse now called the Sands Willets House. After traveling throughout Long Island, he was one day advised that Mr. Dana Backus of Sands Point had a barn available. In Mr. Williams's words, "At last we had found the perfect barn." The Backus farm in Sands Point was soon to be developed into housing plots, and Mr. Backus was only too happy to donate the barn in his wife's memory. Originally built on Sands property in 1690, it was indeed the perfect barn, one that needed to be moved in order for it to be saved. With extremely careful planning and additional funding from other early founders and trustees, the barn was painstakingly disassembled in 1978. A new foundation was built at the Sands Willets House, and it was reassembled with new wood siding and a new cedar roof. 2 years ago, with a grant from New York State, the Historical Society was able to replace the 40-year-old cedar roof and complete other needed repairs so that we could pass this important structure on to future generations. There is tons of information, design drawings, and more on the website, so please check it out if you're interested in old barns. The Manhasset Isles Civic Association is a nonprofit community organization located on Sensink Drive. Since the 1960s, they have offered a variety of recreational opportunities, including beach and mooring rights, barbecues, social events, and fishing tournaments to the residents of Manhasset Isle. This brings us to our smallest plaque, yet possibly the one with the most potential. If you love an older home on the Port Washington Peninsula, this might just be the one for you. Owners Chuck and Lisa Idle became interested in the year of their house was built and did a little delving into 1888. Chuck wrote an article for our website on what he found, including commentary on porches, Nassau versus Queens County, and the Great Snowstorm of 1888. As I've been saying, you can read this thoughtful story of their house on Sandy Hollow Lane, along with other discoveries about 1888, on our website. We just started offering these historic date-only plaques a few months ago, and there are several awaiting installation in warmer weather in the Port Washington Heights section of town. This brings us toward the close, but mark your calendar for June 23rd, when we will be installing a plaque at the Long Island Railroad Station on the anniversary of the 1898 service to Port Washington. Obviously, if you have an old house or business that you feel is worthy of historic recognition, we'd love to hear from you. Perhaps someone notable lived in your house, or perhaps it's just a wonderful old house. In the past few weeks, people have suggested several other local businesses, such as Shields, Alpers, and Knowles Funeral Home, all of whom have been around longer than any of us. This all helps us to keep local history alive. You'll note here at the bottom of our website is a listing for a fascinating Zoom lecture on Long Island maritime history by prize-winning author Bill Blyer on Tuesday, April 15th. And of course, I'll be back on May 18th with another of these short presentations, this one on Sands Point, Known and Unknown. Thank you for your undivided attention, and I'd be happy to take a few questions if you type them into the chat box, or later, feel free to email me at chris@cowneck.org. Laura, back to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Chris. While we wait for people to start submitting questions, I have a couple of my own just to start off with. Well, Michael Rosenberg, first of all, is asking, where is the 1888 house?
That is on Sandy Hollow Lane. I believe it's Lane. It's a tiny little road. If you're heading down off Port Boulevard and you're heading down Sandy Hollow Road, there is a left-hand turn. The street is only a block long. It heads up a hill. It's a beautiful little street with some very old houses. And that is the last house on the right, Chuck and Lisa Idle. They've done a beautiful job with it.
Okay, well, thank you. And somebody else just typed in Chuck's address. I don't think that counts as doxing, but you have a great excuse to start a lemonade stand when the weather gets a little bit warmer.
Yeah.
Another question from Michael, where was that school that started on Bayview Avenue and moved next door? He says to you, I'm not sure. I guess that's to the society. Where on Bayview was that school?
I don't know what the specific street number. If I didn't say it, then I don't know what that is. Let me just take a quick look to see if I had that. No, I just said Bayview Avenue. But if you email me, I can send you that by tomorrow, because we're good friends with the people over at Vincent Smith, being our next door neighbors. But I could send you that address.
So while you're on the subject of emailing Chris, you want to tell us what email address you'd like people to use?
Oh, sure. Chris@cowneck.org. In fact, if you have any questions on our website about any of the content or anything, I don't always have an answer, but I can usually find one out for you. We don't do family genealogical research, and we can't tell you necessarily the history of your house, but there is some information that we have about different places. So feel free to give us a call. There's an email address at the bottom of every page on the website, info@cowneck.org. That also goes to me. So
I think we're going to keep you busy. Carol would like to know, how old does a house have to be in order to earn a plaque?
That is a really interesting question. That's a debate that we've had in-house for a while. Probably, I can't speak for Ross, but I would basically say he probably thinks pre-World War II is probably a good bet.
Okay. And if somebody wanted to do some research on their own house with an eye towards possibly applying to get a plaque, what's a good place to start?
That is a great question. We have actually a little booklet. It's like 20 years old now, but it's something to start with, which we have I think we have a couple dozen copies left about researching your house. There are books written on that, by the way. If you go to barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com, there are whole books that are more up to date than ours that can tell you what online sources you can turn to. One of them would, of course, be the building department in Manhasset.
Right.
They're always a little backlogged, but if you can wait online in the morning, they can often bring you the folder on your house. It's almost always there. If anyone has sold a house in Port Washington, you've probably done this before, but they often will have they may have the original blueprints of the house. They may have the original plot measurements and everything. So that would be one place to stay or to start. And depending on where you are, if you're really near the Mill Pond or near Lower Main Street, or if you're in the estate section, if you're in the area that used to be called Mitchell Farms, which is down like across the street from the area where the yacht clubs are, across the street from the Manhasset Bay Yacht Club. That's Mitchell Farms. We have books on those subjects. They're old books, but the history hasn't changed, obviously. So the Mitchell Farms book covers a tremendous area. There's also one on the Salems, and on the I think there's one on Eastern Crest. These are books that were largely done by George Williams and a few other people years ago, 20 years ago. But in doing the research in the house, those are probably the best place to start if you're in one of those areas that he covered.
Oh, that's really helpful, because when our house was built in 1925, we're in that Mitchell Farms area. We were told that the records that there was a major fire in the county, and a lot of the original records, I guess the deeds and things like that, were lost to a fire. So it's good to know that there's another place just to trace the history. Margarita is asking, which house is considered to be the house that inspired F. Scott Fitzgerald to write The Great Gatsby?
Well, you're going to have
that question was coming.
Yes, that always comes up. That is, if you ask any real estate person, it's the house that they're selling right now.
Yeah.
There's a house now on the market, 235 Middle Neck Road, where I used to live, actually, and in the carriage house, and the ads for it say that was the house. But I knew the owners quite well, and they thought that was just a very funny thing. A lot of people, when I was growing up, thought the house that was out of Prospect Point was the one that was torn down a couple of years ago. Some of the houses that have been claimed were the one. In fact, someone was just saying that maybe it was the Carl Fisher house, but it wasn't. It doesn't line up. Though Fitzgerald could have taken some liberties with that. Gatsby was published in 25. That house was built in 26. And there wasn't even time to have all the lavish parties that they thought. So it's anybody's guess, and I don't think there's a really definitive answer. Though the one that was at Prospect Point, if I had to toss my hat in the ring, I would call for that house. And you can see that house. Actually, you send me an email, I can send you an address where you can see the interior of that house as it was right before it was taken down.
That actually makes sense, because if the Countenack Peninsula was East Egg and Kings Point was West Egg in the book, then the Prospect Point would make sense.
Well, Prospect Point's on the wrong side of our point to see.
It's on the wrong side of ours, yeah.
But
it is.
If you're writing a book, I mean, don't let facts get in the way. You can easily take little literary license and just say that this is the house. It is quite possible that was a very famous newspaper publisher's house in the 20s, and he did throw lavish parties. And Fitzgerald lived in Great Neck and could have come to these parties easily, as was the talked about in the book.
Yep.
And he could have just, moved it in his text.
Okay. I've got 21 messages here, so let me try to move through
Go
these
ahead.
now. Kate and anybody else who missed the first half, this will be available online as soon as we download and edit the recording.
Yes,
It will
I
be
will have
available
a,
through the County Peninsula website and also on Landmark on Main Street's YouTube channel, so you can find it on either one of those places.
but I will edit it. I will edit it back into a
Yeah, well,
sense
don't
that
worry.
does not have the.
Don't worry. We'll take out all the embarrassing parts.
Yeah, exactly.
Priscilla would like to know, were there any old houses on Sandy Hollow Road between Irma and Sandy Hollow Lane? Is there maybe a map somewhere that we can refer her to?
There probably are. We have the Sanborn map, which has recently been digitized, and that was the sort of the atlas. It was an atlas of 18 pages, I believe, 18 spreads that showed where all the houses were in 1925. It's a great snapshot of the town in 25 because, for instance, Beacon Hill isn't there, Montfort Hills isn't there, the Salems aren't there, but the places that are really well detailed. They even talk about what kind of heat they have. So that's a map. If someone, again, if you want to email me that, I love looking at the Sanborn Atlas, so I will look that up for you and take a little snapshot of that block, and so you can see whether there was anything there, at least in 1925. There are a lot of other maps that predate that, the Beers Comstock map from 1873, but that was probably pre-Sandy Hollow Road.
This is a question. Next one is a question that maybe needs to be directed to the Vincent Smith School. Did the reader woman at Vincent Smith also teach Sunday school at Manhasset Friends meeting? Chris, she should maybe contact Vincent Smith School and ask that one.
Yeah, if you again, drop me a line and I'll give you the contact information for the woman that we deal with there, who's very helpful and very knowledgeable about their history.
You're going to be very busy tomorrow. So Alan Berkowitz says, we moved to the area in 1973 and there were still seaplanes landing on the bay. When was that discontinued?
Well, technically, it is still a seaplane base. It is still on the nautical maps. And I am a drone pilot. And when I click on my little app to get insurance, it jacks it up twice as much if I'm within a mile of that place. So they still were flying in and out of there when I was a kid also. The Thompsons have the very first house inside of Sands Point, and there is still a hangar there, and there's still a seaplane in that, though it hasn't been used in 20 years. But that's probably about, I would guess, the late 70s, early 80s was probably the last time. But I do remember hearing that a seaplane landed here like 3 or 4 years ago. It can, because it is still illegal. They still don't have any boats moored in that little corridor for seaplanes. It's just not generally used, but you could certainly land your seaplane there if you so choose.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've seen one or two, but nothing regular. Rick Shorin is doing a nice little commercial for Landmark. Surprised that you didn't mention the Main Street School or Flower Hill School. Rick, we did cover the Main Street School in some detail in our November presentation, and that one is available. The video from that one is available.
Yep.
And you touched on this briefly, and I think it's going to come up from a couple of people. Linda Adams is asking, have these houses been designated as historical landmarks? Can they be renovated or changed, or are renovations restricted? Can you just explain the difference between your recognition program and an actual historic landmark designation?
Our recognition is basically just sort of a feel-good thing to try and get more people aware of their local history. It has absolutely no legal limitations whatsoever. To get designation, as we have for the Dodge Homestead, as we have for the Sands Willis House, as we have for the barn, you have to fill out an enormous amount of paperwork and documentation that goes to the state of New York. It's a very laborious process, and we did it. It was done long before I got to the society. You do it with the state first, and then it's photographs, it's measurements, it's really an onerous process. And when you finish that, if the state accepts it, then the feds accept it, and then you are on the state and national historic registers. Then, oddly enough, you can still do pretty much what you want with the house. It's a misnomer to think that you can't. I mean, we could tear down the Sands Willis house with no legal. We would never do that, of course, but
whereas we can't even touch the exterior of the Landmark on Main Street building without.
Right.
Yeah.
There are limitations.
Right.
There are much more limitations if you are in a historic district. Roslyn is a historic district. If you have a historic district in which it takes 80% of the people living there or owning property there to agree to become a district, then you can't do anything, and you can't paint your fence a different color. You can't change the color of the house. Roslyn is a great example of that downtown area around the park is just absolutely exquisite with old houses. But because they became a historic district, I believe in the early 60s, might have been earlier.
Yeah.
But
so there's a number of different degrees of restrictions on historic buildings. Michael Rosenberg, here's the answer to your question. The Harbor School was at 59 Bayview. So that's the answer to your question from earlier. What else is here? A couple of classmate shout outs. Fred Falconer, class of 64.
Oh, great.
Shouted out by Amy Bass. Herman Cadams was my optometrist. Here's a great one. Zausner's booted John McEnroe out of the tennis academy because he was an incorrigible teenager.
Great story.
So I guess maybe we should put up a plaque just for that.
Yeah, that's pretty
somebody's great. Asking, now this one I've heard asked many times before, where did Perry Como live?
Perry Como lived in Sands Point off of, it wasn't Messenger Lane, it was one down from that, maybe West Creek Farms Road. When I was in high school, I knew the girl whose family lived that, and when you rang the doorbell, it played White Christmas. Yeah. And there was beautiful.
But you know, we have that upcoming program on Sands Point.
Yeah, I'll save some of that. I'll find out more about that. In fact, I'll see if I can get in touch with her and get some stories.
Priscilla Alvarez is asking, is the site of the Baxter House still considered a historical site, even though the house is gone?
No. It's gone. It's gone.
Okay, and was the J. Foreman House, again, we're going to have a Sands Point talk as well, J. Foreman House in Sands Point designated a landmark, or does it just have a plaque?
I don't know specifically. I don't think it's a historical landmark. The Sands Point has its own designation and their own plaque program for designating historic structures. It doesn't carry any legal limitations either.
Right.
But I know the J. Foreman House fairly well. Marcia was a donor to the society and a great friend of our society. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman. And in fact, one of our recent journals featured a big mural that she and her kids painted in the dining room, which it took them a whole year to paint it. I don't think that house was landmarked in any way. She would have mentioned that. I was in the house many times.
Yeah. Well, we're getting a lot of information about Perry Como. So when we get to that point in our Sands Point presentation.
Save it for me.
It's all here in the chat, and we thank you for that. I think we're about winding down our questions now, but as always, if you do have questions on any of these, please email Chris at chris@cownec.org or the society at info@cownec.org. And you can find information on their upcoming programs on their website. And you can find information about our programs at Landmark. As Chris mentioned, we're up to the second part of our 5-part climate action series, which is every Thursday night in partnership with Transition Town. And the second one is this week, and it goes for the next 3 weeks after this. All of these programs are free. All of these programs are available after their first airing on Landmark's YouTube channel. Lots of other good stuff coming up from both Landmark and the Cannock Peninsula Historical Society. So we urge you to please stay in touch. Sign up for the next one of these that's coming. Keep watching, keep asking questions, and let's see how many more plaques we can get up there.
There you go.
So I thank you all. We're going to end this one for now, and hope that the conversation continues. So thank you, and thank you so much to Chris and to Ann Latner for helping host this program.
Thank you all for coming tonight.